Our first afternoon session, Democratic Errands, Pursuit of Citizen Efficacy and Deep Diversity in Complex Societies. And I will introduce our first speaker, Dominique Leydet, from philosophy at the Université du Québec at Montréal.
Well, first, let me say that I'm extremely happy to be here today, and I want to thank the two main organizers of this event, Dilip Gaonkar and Jocelyn McClure. I'm particularly happy to be here to pay tribute to Charles Taylor, who has been, over his long career, an exemplar of how a philosopher can be deeply engaged in a political life and a political debates of his polity without ever ceasing to be, in the deepest sense, a philosopher committed to the search for truth. And this has been true since early in his career, through the period of what we have called mega constitutional politics of 1980s and the 1990s, and also to the more recent events surrounding the notion of laïcité in Quebec. Throughout those years, Taylor has been, for people like me, a model about how to be an engaged citizen while maintaining, to the highest degree, one's intellectual and moral integrity. So I'm very glad to be here today. Today, I would like to focus our attention on the notion of citizen efficacy, a concept that occupies a significant place in Taylor's reflections on democracy. The concept, though not the term, appears in early essays like Power and Participation, published in 1970. It is also central to an essay from 2007, Cultures of Democracy and Citizen Efficacy, and also to more recent contributions like Reconstructing Democracy from 2020, co-written with Patricia Nance and Madeleine Beaubien-Taylor, as well as Degenerations of Democracy from 2022, co-written with Craig Calhoun and Dilip Gaonkar. The notion of citizen efficacy seems to me particularly important as a bridging concept between two conceptions of democracy that are often contrasted. On the one hand, participatory democracy, where the focus is on the capacity of citizens to act together, what we can call the horizontal dimension of democratic politics, and on the other hand, representative democracy, where the focus is on relations between citizens and elected officials, the vertical dimension of democracy. Contemporary political discourse often tends to oppose those two conceptions, as when, for instance, a dichotomy is set up between les urnes et la rue, between the polls and the street. Within the academic field of democratic theory, they constitute two distinct strands of the literature that often do not meet. There is, however, a line of democratic theorists, going from Tocqueville to Habermas and Bernard Manin, who insist that there is an intrinsic connection between the vertical and the horizontal dimensions of contemporary democracies. These theorists share a belief in the necessity of a representative form of government, in what Benjamin Constant called les grands États modernes, while at the same time acknowledging that representative government tends to privilege the interests of the elites, controlling its main institutions, while shortchanging the interests and needs of non-elites. The gravitational pull of representative democracy towards a government ruled by the elites and for the elites creates potentially acute problems of legitimacy and stability. According to this line of thought, representative democracy can protect itself against its own oligarchic tendencies only by securing the conditions for the effective collective agency of ordinary citizens. Now, I see Charles Taylor as part of that line of democratic theory. Indeed, his notion of citizen efficacy provides a particularly helpful perspective through which we can work out more clearly the relations between the horizontal and vertical dimension of contemporary democracy and tackle some of the most difficult challenges facing us today. So what is citizen efficacy? Taylor sketches a definition of the concept in Degenerations of Democracy. And I quote, the sense that ordinary citizens can have in a democracy that if they combine their efforts, they can influence government through elections and thus redress grievances and bring about tolerable conditions for themselves and their families. Taylor elaborates this brief definition in his writings, and let me just highlight 4 features that I find particularly important. Firstly, though Taylor often describes citizen efficacy as a sense that ordinary citizens can have, it is not something purely subjective in the head, as it were, of the citizens. It is a consciousness that develops out of experience, one that teaches citizens that when they act together, they can exercise enough influence on government to secure the adoption of policies that protect their interest. In fact, whether citizens in a state do enjoy high level of political efficacy can usually be verified by looking at the policies adopted in that state and seeing whether they track how ordinary citizens define their interests and their needs. This is why Taylor sometimes uses expressions like actual citizen efficacy, or effective popular voice, or the reality of citizen efficacy. Secondly, the collective action through which ordinary citizens can exercise influence is described by Taylor as mediated through institutions. 2 models have proved particularly important in our history. The first one is the voluntary associations described by Tocqueville. They were, writes Taylor, close enough to the base to be potentially under its control and with enough collective clout in the larger society to compel power wielders to listen to them. The second model is linked to what Taylor calls the tamed class struggle characteristic of Western Europe after the Second World War, where you have unions and political parties on the left able to elaborate concrete objectives, responding to the needs and interests of their members, and the very real gains that they achieved through their mobilization, which provided their members with a sense of political efficacy, even though these organizations themselves were largely ruled by elites. Thirdly, Taylor often contrasts genuine forms of participation to those that are purely sham. The key issue here is whether participation helps citizens identify and articulate their concrete needs and interests and work towards the adoption of policies that actually improves their lives. Sham participation, in contrast, is purely performative. Now, in Power and Participation, Taylor offers a scathing critique of Trudeau-mania, the popular wave of enthusiasm that surrounded the entry into politics of Pierre-Elliott Trudeau in 1968. At the time, there was much talk about enhanced forms of participation, but, writes Taylor in 1970, and I quote, "The whole success of the operation lay in giving the vote an enhanced significance in the voter's own mind. According to Taylor, this is a kind of imitation in gesture only, a semi-magical plebiscitary operation which leaves everything as is." Similarly, in the Generations of Democracy, Taylor writes about Donald Trump that he, and I quote, claimed to offer increased citizen efficacy, but in relation to the real grievances and inequality that non-elites suffer from, the offer was pure sham. In fact, the Trump presidency exacerbated inequality. Fourthly, and I think very importantly, genuine participation produces cognitive benefits. Citizens learn how to give a definite form to their needs and demands, which makes their action potentially more effective. They learn facts about the world and develop an understanding of how the political system works, about how to get things done. By interacting with other citizens who may come from different backgrounds, they also learn to overcome, or at least bracket, stereotypes and mistrust towards those who are not like them. So there is this virtuous circle of citizen efficacy, ideally. So in democracies with high levels of citizen efficacy, ordinary citizens can see the point of participating in the political system. They inform themselves and vote in large numbers while having the resources and the venues to effectively influence government. This, in turn, makes representative institutions more responsive to their needs and interests and increases the system's legitimacy. But of course, the story that Taylor has been telling us for quite some time is the story of the Great Degradation. The world of Tocqueville voluntary associations has pretty much disappeared, and the end of the Trente Glorieuses signaled a significant weakening of unions and working class parties, And the new social movements and the new political parties that came to life in the last quarter of the 20th century have not been able to replace that loss. The net result is a downward spiraling effect, a loss of citizen efficacy, both subjectively and objectively, a growing dissatisfaction towards representative institutions, which seems incapable of relaying and responding to the needs of ordinary citizens, increasing citizen disengagement as to the rights and degenerations of democracy, and this is for me important, the dumbing down of the electorate, the grasp of issues and of what is related to what declines among great swaths of the population. In short, there seems to be an uncoupling of the vertical and horizontal dimensions of contemporary democracies. And this is extremely dangerous and makes democratic politics vulnerable to the kind of plebiscitary and authoritarian deviations that we've seen develop in Europe and in the Americas. So, what is to be done? It is precisely at this point, in trying to answer this question, that we can appreciate the usefulness of Taylor's notion of citizen efficacy, since it reminds us that a capacity to act together politically is something that can be learned and developed from the ground up. And so the question, what is to be done, takes on a more manageable form. Instead of simply despairing of our current predicament or losing ourselves in grand visions that seem entirely out of reach, we can ask the following question. What are the spaces where ordinary citizens today can develop their capacity for collective agency? This is a concrete question and one that we can answer without losing our way into generalities. Taylor himself has remained remarkably consistent over the years in the answer that he gives to this question. In his early essays, as well as in his more recent contributions, he insists on the importance of local communities as spaces where citizens can, through participation, build a capacity for collective agency. For instance, in Power and Participation, Taylor notes, and I quote, that meaningful participation by ordinary people comes most easily at the face-to-face level of the village, the neighborhood, and the local school board. Of course, many of us know, and many point out, that civic participation is particularly low at the local level. But Taylor counters this objection by remarking that it is the increased centralization of contemporary governance, which deprives local communities of any real power, that explains this situation. He says that in the Power and Participation. And this is why, at the time, Taylor advocated in favor of institutional change that would give real power to local and regional governments while pushing for a major reform of Parliament itself. Some 50 years later, in Reconstructing Democracy from 2020, Taylor and his co-authors connect democratic degeneration to the erosion of local communities. And I quote, they suggest that only if we enhance and reinvigorate democracy at the base will the citizenry find clarity about what to ask for, of what future to envision for their community or region. Only then can local communities put pressure on their representatives in policy-making bodies to push for more courageous policies. The emphasis here is less on local government itself than on bottom-up community organizing. In his more recent writings, Taylor does not advocate directly for major institutional change. He and his co-writers call instead for a strategy of coordination and alliance between local initiatives and broader movements for change to scale up, as it were, local efforts to strengthen democratic capacities to the level of the whole polity. This inflection in Taylor's views perhaps makes sense, given the repeated failures that attempts to reform formal political institutions have encountered recently in many liberal democracies. So for instance, in Quebec and in Canada, we have remained incapable of changing our electoral system. The idea seems to be that though the reinvigoration of contemporary democracy cannot be achieved entirely at the horizontal level and will have to lead at some point to significant change in institutions of representative democracy, it must certainly start at the base of democratic politics. So Taylor's notion of efficacy helps us to understand why this is so, why we need to start there, to relearn, as it were, how to act together in a way that actually has a grip on reality and changes stuff. And he also explains to us why there cannot be any easy shortcuts in this endeavor. Here, as in so much else, Dilly gives us a bracing and incisive reflection on our reality, and one that we should do well to heed. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Thank you, Nigel. And many thanks as well to Jocelyn and to Delete for putting this on and for inviting me. My name's Liam. I'm also, in addition to my position at Rice, I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Transcultural Studies. And as the Assistant Director, I am under strict marching orders from the Director to do two things today. I'm supposed to be brief, and I'm supposed to be personal. So that's what we're going to try to do. In addition to my role at CTS, I'm also an alumnus of McGill University. This is where I completed a BA in Women's Studies, and then later an MA in Communication Studies and Art History. McGill's also, I should say, where I first encountered Charles's work. Reading excerpts from Sources of the Self in a very, very difficult seminar in, I think, the Department of East Asian Studies, while also following the work he was doing at that time with the Bouchard-Taylor Commission. My memories of both of those encounters are colored with an admittedly unearned pride that I was a student in the same university as such an influential and accomplished philosopher. For better or worse, I am not here to revisit my undergraduate years. Instead, I'm here to talk about Charles's democratic errands. I'm not going to spend much time talking about any of his books because, well, first and foremost, the leak told me not to and to say something personal. And second, because I didn't want the task of trying to do justice to any one of them in so few minutes. Moreover, anything I could offer about Charles's works would only repeat, and probably a lot less eloquently, the deserving praise that others here are in a better position to elaborate. I'll say only thank you for writing them. And in particular, thank you for modern social imaginaries. It has influenced and shaped how I think, how I write, and how I teach. While I'm not well situated to say something about Charles's major works, I am, however, in a position to say something about at least one small aspect of one of his more recent democratic errands. As you are all well aware, I'm sure, Charles's career has not been limited to the academy. In different moments, at different conjunctures, he's ventured into the public sphere, the political realm, and the activist world. Some of these ventures are quite well known. In Montreal, my mind goes immediately to the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, and then to his political career with the New Democratic Party. Other ventures are less well known, if no less laudable, founding the New Left Review or his participation in Ban the Bomb activism. These are big ventures and democratic errands par excellence. The democratic errand I've seen Charles pursue over the last few years is much more modest. So for the last 3 years, the Center for Transcultural Studies, the Central European University, and the MasterCard Foundation, through the extremely generous facilitation of Craig Calhoun, have hosted a summer school on democracy at CEU's campus in Budapest. Charles has been on the faculty every single year. His presence there is, I am positive, a large part of the explanation for why students from around the world apply to the school in extremely high numbers and are so eager to participate. Unlike other summer schools, and thanks to the generosity of the sponsors, the Democracy Summer School prioritizes applications from students from Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and then provides comprehensive funding to the students coming from those places who need it. The result is an exceptionally diverse group of young people and aspiring scholars from all over the world, representing all kinds of identities and experiences, all deeply invested in promoting democratic agendas. I want to briefly mention two experiences at that summer school that I think tell us something about the kind of democratic errand runner Charles is. The first experience is from this year's summer school, some 5 months ago now. So at the beginning of each one of these, when the students are assembled for the first time and Charles is introduced to the group, there is a real palpable barrier between him and the students. The barrier is built, of course, from the students' ideas about who he is, what he's done, and what it means to be in the company of someone who has left such a mark on 20th and 21st century thought. Through no real fault of his own, the students treat him differently than they treat, for instance, me. As a case in point, this past year, one of the most academically precocious students came up to me midway through the course and asked if I thought it would be okay if he went out on a limb and invited Charles for a coffee to discuss his research. He said he'd been trying to work up the nerve for days and wanted to make sure he wasn't stepping out of line. This kind of treatment, while completely understandable, can make meaningful exchanges difficult. To address it, whether or not it's conscious, Charles's strategy seems to me to be to cheerfully ignore the pedestal he's been provided with and to get to work disarming the students by engaging with them, by giving their ideas the same degree of attention and care he gives his own. At the concluding dinner of this year's summer school, I was fortunate enough to sit beside Charles and Oak, surrounded by students from all over the world. In the context of the monumental view that the students have of him, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of that dinner was the balance. Charles graciously and patiently answered questions about his own work and opinions. He even at one point recited a few lines of poetry that he'd been thinking about. But he did it in a way that opened the conversation to the students. There was a young woman from a wealthy American school who was eager to hear his thoughts on the election. Charles first responded with his usual thoughtfulness, but within a minute or two, I looked over and saw him listening intently while the student explained her own views. At the risk of stating the obvious, his winning tactic basically boiled down to caring about what they had to say and then responding with his genuine enthusiasm. The thing the students at that dinner felt wasn't just that Charles Taylor took the time to listen to them, but that, in that moment, listening to them was what he genuinely wanted to be doing. As the dinner was wrapping up, I asked Charles if he'd enjoyed himself, and with a smile he paused, thought about it, and then told me that he was very grateful for all the conversation. The second experience is more personal. A couple of months before this year's summer school, Charles sent an email to me and some of the other faculty members asking for feedback on an outline he'd written that sketched out what he was planning to say in his course sessions. When I first saw the email, I was, if I'm being honest, delighted to be included and honored that Charles thought my opinion among those worth seeking out. So when I opened the attached outline, I was taken aback to see that part of it was a response to something I had presented in my lecture the previous year. Fittingly, it was about the status of democracy and the role of solidarity in the 2022 Canadian Freedom Convoy. The content of his response was important and focused on big questions about excluded individuals and the importance of understanding the role social movements play in bringing people together, building solidarity, even when the ends of those movements are misguided, misinformed, or even harmful. The interesting thing for me now, thinking back on this exchange with Charles, is that he basically did the same thing with me that I'd watched him do time and again with the summer school students. In a moment, and over email, Charles had transformed my relationship to the conversation from one where I was bewildered by the fact it was taking place at all, to one where I was fully engaged, thinking through my own work with his fresh insights and hard questions. I think the most important thing that Charles has taught me about running democratic errands, and something I'm keeping front of mind in light of recent events south of the border, is that the ends of the errands aren't what necessarily sustains and reinforces democracy. It's how seriously you take what others have to say. It's how good you are, and Charles, you're very good at listening. It's the benefit of the doubt that you extend by default, and it's a commitment to ideas, whether or not they're your own. Thank you.
So I too would like to thank Dilip and Jocelyn and everyone else that has contributed to making this wonderful event possible and bringing us all together today. It's really a delight. So, slightly rewriting the title of an essay published about a dozen years ago, in my brief remarks today, I want to ask and attempt to sketch a partial answer to the following question. How has Charles Taylor been good to think with? The approach will be two-pronged. First, I'll talk briefly about the impact of the work on my own thought and intellectual trajectory. And then second, I'll turn to Charles's work as a public philosopher and citizen, and will sketch ever so lightly the outlines of an answer to the following question. How can Charles's work as a political and public philosopher illuminate and enable us to address two interrelated issues that are surely on all of our minds today, namely the profoundly ominous results of the recent election in the US, and secondly, the fate of democratic forms of life across the globe. So my first encounter with Charles's work occurred early in my graduate studies at UCLA. I was an undergraduate major in history at UC Berkeley, where I took lots of history classes, lots of philosophy classes, and political science classes taught only by Hannah Pitkin and Michael Rogan. It was on the basis of those classes taught by Pitkin and Rogan that I decided to pursue graduate studies in political science. At the time, and thinking sort of back on this, I realized how deeply naive I was when I made the decisions that I made, the fateful decisions that I made. I thought that all the professors I was going to have in my political science classes were going to display the same kind of wisdom and erudition that was such an undeniable feature of Hannah Pitkin's work, or just the electric brilliance of Michael Rogan's mind. To my great dismay, that was not the case. I did have some great professors, wonderful professors in political theory, Carol Bateman, Dick Ashcraft, and others. I also had some excellent professors in some other fields as well. There are people doing very good work in American political development. Steve Skronik, who's now at Yale, Karen Oren, who's retired but was a really outstanding scholar. So there were some people in other fields. But really the courses that sort of dominated my early coursework were courses taught by people that had a very particular view of the discipline of political science. And as I began taking this coursework, I just became sort of deeply, in many ways, distressed and dismayed. It wasn't just that the professors who taught those courses, as I said, lacked Pitkin's wisdom and Rogan's brilliance. Not many scholars anywhere in the world could match them along those metrics. But that a large number of them championed a specific model of political inquiry and considered loyalty to that model to be an indication of one's fitness to become a respected scholar in the field. The lack of attention that was granted to history, that was granted to culture, that was granted to context was jarring. And I began wondering at that point whether I was perhaps mistaken in choosing political science rather than history or philosophy as my field of graduate study. When I began to read systematically through the sprawling literatures of the philosophy and history and sociology of science, as well as the philosophy of social sciences, I gained a large and impressive list of interlocutors. Many of them will be familiar to you if you've read this literature, right? There's a sort of classic, sort of empiricists, Hempel, Carnap, Popper, there are Kuhn, Feyerabend, Hansen, there's Cartwright and Gallison, there's Ian Hacking, there's Bruno Latour, Stephen Wolger, and on and on and on. And then once one moves, of course, to the philosophy of the human sciences, philosophy of social sciences, there's a wonderful literature in hermeneutics itself, Ricoeur, Gadamer, others, Habermas. The literature is really quite rich. Winch and others, Luke's. I know I'm leaving out many other names, but this was a rich literature, and I felt like I gained a number of valuable interlocutors. Even in cases where I disagreed quite vehemently with their conclusion and their ultimate positions. I learned a lot. I felt like I was intellectually challenged. And I was struggling with things that seemed meaningful to me. But when I read through that work and became increasingly acquainted with sort of the broad landscape of what was out there, there was one particular individual whose work I would go back to again and again and again. And unsurprisingly for all of you who are here, that person's work is Charles Taylor. In classic hermeneutical fashion, Charles had certain skills, certain abilities, certain qualities that really set the work apart. I mean, first of all, because, he took seriously, the obligation of hermeneutical charity, he was oftentimes able to give a better account of his opponent's work than they were able to give of their own. That's absolutely the case. And oftentimes you want to really understand a thinker, if it's a thinker that Charles has taken the time to engage with in some really serious way, reading Charles' work on their thought is oftentimes the best place to start. And I've done this time and time again. The wonderful essay on Foucault and political theory many years ago. The fantastic essay on Bourdieu. On and on and on. Charles is an incredibly careful reader of texts and displays this remarkable hermeneutical charity and sort of sensitivity to nuance that allows him to understand these texts in a kind of deep way that very few do. And as I said, in some ways, as even the authors themselves don't seem to fully understand. So that was one of the things which really impressed me from the very start. Then of course, there's his uncanny ability to articulate his ideas with just a remarkable clarity and almost pointillist precision, right? Showing how and why, for example, in these cases, their naturalist models of social scientific inquiry had come to have the kind of grip on them that it did, right? And this, of course, is a feature of much of this work. If you read it and if you engage with people that are sort of strong-willed champions of this perspective, it's not just that they hold a view, but oftentimes there's almost a kind of sort of zealous quality to it. They sort of see themselves as sort of the forefront of a big wave. And that's fine in and of itself. I don't have an objection to it. But it is something that has to actually be accounted for, right? I mean, how do people come to have the kind of sort of, deep affective, attitudes, both towards their own work, but then also towards those who don't share their same kind of, deep, engagement with or defense of this very particular sort of model of how to engage in, social and political inquiry. So, I mean, those were qualities that just sort of stood out from the very start, and really separated his work from everything else I was reading. I mean, of course, and I don't deny this. I'd be the first to say it. Gadamer's work is brilliant. Ricoeur's work is brilliant. I learned an enormous amount from all of them, but at the end of the day, I learned more from Charles's work, partly because it was just so much clearer. And also because, Charles has this really amazing ability to actually, as it were, shuttle back and forth between, the most abstract kinds of ontological, epistemological issues, issues of normative theory on the one hand, that oftentimes are super abstract, and then at the same time, to bring it all down to earth with just so remarkably appropriate examples. If there's in some ways, that was one of the most important lessons that I learned reading that work. I think that many of us who engage in social and political theory, philosophy, find ourselves more comfortable operating at sort of high levels of abstraction, and that it's important to be able to ground those ideas in much more concrete ways, and that finding the right kind of example is really critical, and it's really a talent. And few people have it. But Charles is someone who, really has it in surplus. So, I was reading through this work. I was really just sort of blown away at his ability to do all of these things, and to distill, his opponent's arguments sort of down to their essence, as it were. And you could see this even in the sort of opening paragraphs of, Interpretation of Science of the Man. I was going back and sort of rereading it the other day, and this is really a case in point, right? So starting with the opening sentence, is there a sense in which interpretation is essential to explanation in the sciences of man, an incredibly simple, straightforward, direct question, right? He then tells his readers in crisp, condensed, non-technical prose what interpretation is and the conditions that must be satisfied for an object of inquiry to be an object of a science of interpretation. And then finally, he sums up, in a single sentence, what a science of interpretation must have. And after one's read these opening pages, it's really only sort of 1.5 to 2 pages long. But after you've read these opening pages, everything somehow seems remarkably clear, even obvious. And the amazing thing, of course, is that anyone who works on these issues knows that none of it is obvious. That it takes enormous labor and enormous intellectual effort to be able to make it look clear and obvious to one's audience. And that was a talent that I was sort of awestruck with. I mean, I found it just remarkable. And as I've said, it's really, there's really sort of no one else, not Dilthey, not Gadamer, not Ricoeur, Habermas, Winch, who could do what Charles does so effortlessly in these opening pages of interpretation of the science of man. And this, of course, is just basically sort of a setup for what is to follow. This is the prelude. It's not the meat of the essay itself. So the other thing I found, sort of really exhilarating about the work is its forward-looking perspective. There are a lot of philosophers and social theorists at the time who spent a lot of time attacking positivism, neo-positivism, behavioralism, rational choice theory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There was, a cottage industry and all of that at a certain point. But what very few of these scholars actually did, it was taking up the much more challenging task of actually charting a route toward a post-empiricist, hermeneutically informed conception of social and political inquiry that was culturally sensitive, that was historically rich, and that was normatively robust. And he did this not only in his philosophical essays on interpretation, but also in books both large and small. Sources of the Self, The Ethics of Authenticity, The Secular Age, The Malaise of Modernity, and now, of course, Cosmic Connections. Reading Charles's work, it often seems to me that he's performing microsurgery while others are still using 19th century medical instruments. It does. And reading many of these publications over the past few days, it's still true, right? As I've sort of returned to them, in some cases after not having read them in quite some time. Interpretation of the sciences of man remains an absolute intellectual tour de force. No question about it. And neutrality in political science deserves its status as a canonical contribution to the philosophy of the human sciences. And moreover, many of his other essays, which unfortunately found smaller audiences, are no less impressive. I mean, I found political theory's practice to be an incredibly rich and rewarding essay, and I could name a dozen others. And as I said, unfortunately, there's a tendency of many scholars, many readers, to sort of herd towards both interpretation of the science of the man and neutrality in political science, and really not venture any further. And I have to say, having taken some time to venture further, it's an impoverished existence to confine yourself to just those two essays. There's a lot more out there, an enormous amount more to be learned. Moreover, to a young and at times despairing graduate student, reading this corpus was really a jolt of fresh air. And his work became the single most important inspiration for my own dissertation and first book, The Disorder of Political Inquiry. And honestly, so reflecting back upon all this, I can't imagine having written either of those things, the dissertation or the book, without the insight and inspiration that his writings provided. And the other thing which is really amazing is that Charles really served, I think, for me, and I suspect for many other people in the audience today, as a kind of model of intellectual engagement, right? Of what it means to do or to engage in, intellectual discourse, intellectual debate, intellectual contestation, in a way that is dignified and serious, and as I've already said, charitable, and once again, Charles was really sort of, in many ways, I think, sort of the model of how to do that, in a truly sort of dignified and impressive way, right? There is, of course, the sort of, hermeneutical charity that I already referred to. There is a kind of, passion for understanding that just animates all of his work and that is totally infectious to those who either read the work or engage with him in conversation. There's also, sorry, I have a bunch of marginal comments here that I'm trying to translate for my own bad handwriting. There's a sort of this sense of the excitement of intellectual inquiry itself. There's this notion that the point of intellectual inquiry, the point of engaging in moral and political philosophy or philosophy generally, isn't just to sort of score points on one's opponents, but ultimately to change the world, right? To make the world a different and better place. There's also, something I've learned is that when you read Charles's work, it's always distinctively Charles's. It can't be mistaken for anyone else's. And he has a voice of his own, which is very audible and very distinctive, and very characteristic. And when I began sort of thinking about sort of, how I wanted to write and how I wanted to think and how I wanted to express my own thoughts, it made me realize that, the only way that you can actually truly be a good philosopher, a good thinker, is to develop a voice of your own. And I think that that's one of the things that that I have learned from reading this this body of work and for engaging with Charles, in other ways over the years. And then finally, there's another quality which many others have already mentioned, but I want to mention it one more time. Just his impressive egalitarianism. The academic world, is a world that's deeply stratified. It's deeply hierarchical. And, so many people who are at or near the top of that hierarchy or even in the middle of it, take great pleasure in condescending to those, who, aren't, deemed to be at, the stratum that they happen to occupy. And Charles is an individual that has never had any interest in any of that stuff. As Liam has said, as others have said, it's really a remarkable quality. He obviously deeply enjoys engaging with others who are interested in ideas, whether they happen to be famous philosophers, whether they happen to be graduate students, whether they happen to be undergraduates who are taking their first class. And this, I think, is just, once again, remarkable and remarkably admirable quality of his. So, another thing that I've really, always greatly admired about Charles is his ability to address, widely different audiences. And this is a hard thing to do. I mean, we all know that because we all have to do it, whether it's in the classroom or in other contexts. And going out of the classroom and trying to, trying to, speak to a broader public is very difficult. We're not used to it. We're very attached to our highly technical, highly specialized vocabularies. And it doesn't necessarily come naturally to us to be able to, translate our ideas into an idiom, into a language, into vocabulary that is widely accessible, yet still, is not is not reductionist in any obvious way. But second here, in books like The Explanation of Behavior, Science of the Self, Separate, The Language Animal, all these books, we see sort of Charles the philosopher, Charles, the intellectual. We still see Charles, the intellectual, and Charles, the philosopher, in other books like The Pattern of Politics, Multiculturalism and Politics of Recognition, Reconciling the Solitudes, and the co-authored books on democracy, right? Degenerations of Democracy and Reconstructing Democracy. In my mind, these are no less impressive as contributions to public debate and discourse. It's obviously a different experience reading them than it is reading the 600-page books that Charles has produced over the years. But it's incredibly rewarding, and it's also incredibly laudable. Charles takes his responsibilities as a citizen as seriously as he takes his responsibilities as a philosopher. I think that he manages to sort of discharge those obligations with the same kind of dignity and grace and impressive manner. So for decades now, Charles has assembled this sort of laudable body of work that diagnoses, offers prescriptions for addressing some of the most profoundly important crises and controversies. He does so, as I've said, in lucid, non-technical prose. And his numerous essays on federalism and nationalism in Canada, which sought to address the problems of political fragmentation by imagining decentralized constitutional structures that would accommodate different modes of belonging. This was a very distinctive and very important intervention in public debates about nationalism, federalism, liberalism, democracy, and identity that really reached in many ways their apogee in the 1995 Quebec referendum. Moreover, for many years now, Charles has contributed to public debates about threats to democracy in Western societies and across the globe. Indeed, I regret to say in some ways, almost exactly 8 years ago, he gave a talk at my own home institution, University of California, Irvine, only a few days after Donald Trump won the 2016 presidential election. Scrapping the talk he planned to deliver, Charles spoke extemporaneously to a large audience still stunned and bewildered by the electoral results. In classic Taylor fashion, he outlined many of the arguments that would later appear in Reconstructing Democracy and Degenerations of Democracy. More specifically, he talked eloquently and convincingly about the need to reconstruct democracy from the bottom up. That is, as he puts it, to enhance and reinvigorate democracy at the base, so that it can, as he puts it, put pressure on representatives and policymaking bodies to push for more courageous policies. Now, many of these prescriptions, things like self-organization at the local level, the creation of modes of government, the creation of modes of government initiated consultation with ordinary citizens, the need to attend to the mechanisms by which the remaking of local political communities can work to reconstruct and renew democracy as a political system. All of these things were, in my mind, very badly needed, and unfortunately remain so today. But 8 years after that talk, 4 years after the publication of Reconstructing Democracy, 2 years after the publication of Degenerations of Democracy, and 4 days after Trump's most recent electoral victory, we find ourselves at a still more ominous crossroad. I'd like to make a personal plea to Charles, realizing that it's not really a reasonable plea, but I'm going to make it nonetheless, right? Because it's not the kind of thing that one should be pleading to for someone who's celebrating their 93rd birthday, right? They should be relieved of other obligations, not being asked to, to take on more. But even at the age of 93, I hope that Charles will continue to address these matters in work that aims to reach a broader public audience. Today, there are so many questions that need to be asked. For example, does the re-election of Donald Trump, this time with the support of a small majority of voters rather than the less than 47% vote share that he received in both 2016 and 2020, does this warrant any revision in the analyses offered over the past several years? Or is the problem exclusively a failure to prioritize and act on the recommendations outlined over the past several years? Are there issues that have been touched on in earlier essays, like, for example, the impact of social media and digital communication, that perhaps require more sustained analysis? In this regard, it's remarkable how much the media landscape has changed even over the past few years, and it can be reasonably argued that this restructured media ecosystem poses new challenges. Fox News, of course, has been around for a long time now, but how significant is it that Trump's #1 cheerleader, Elon Musk, now owns Twitter? And how significant was Russian disinformation? There are also, of course, profoundly important questions to be asked about the role of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and anti-trans attitudes played in the outcome of the election. Once again, these aren't questions that invite quick or easy answers, and I'm certainly not asking for or expecting them today. But as citizens who care deeply about the fate of democracy and the betterment of the human condition, I think that we all hope that even at age 93, you'll continue to be an audible and humane voice in our public and political dialogue. Thank you.